I'm the owner of a broken brain. And this is something I'm actually really thankful for. But it hasn't always been that way. I was about 12 years old when I first noticed things were malfunctioning in my head. My world began to shrink. I became withdrawn, deeply depressed. Everything felt like so intense, but also numb at the same time. Every injustice scarred me, and I hated myself. I hated being this cliche, melodramatic teenager, but I felt trapped inside my own skin, my own mind. I found solace with other kids who shared my struggles, who hated themselves, who hurt themselves, who wanted to die. It was a really dark crowd, sure, but it felt so good to be understood. And they became my escape, my second family, my home. And then when I was almost 16, my world was interrupted when my actual family suddenly moved states to the middle of nowhere. Being ripped away from my friends was jarring, and I was certain it would kill me. But instead of killing me, it brought me back to myself. The sudden isolation, it allowed me to think for myself, and I remember sitting on the floor, alone in my new bedroom, where it occurred to me for the very first time that maybe I didn't want to be miserable for the rest of my life. And maybe I didn't have to be. Like, what if it was possible there was another way? And just that little spark of an idea, that little hope, it was enough to start me on a slightly different journey. I decided I wanted to get well. And so I set about on a journey to try to navigate this broken brain instead of being totally overcome by it. And I promised myself that if I ever figured out how to do that, I would come back and share what I'd learned with others who were still in the depths of their pain. And as I started to get some distance from my former misery, what I found surprised me. There were actually some advantages to having a brain like mine. So I began experimenting with leveraging the unique parts of my head as features instead of just writing them off as deficiencies. And it turns out, sketchy brain chemistry isn't always a problem to be solved. It can be a guidebook, a map for how to show up in the world. My managed depressive tendencies could become an asset in creating a big, beautiful life. And so as I started to feel better, I wanted to make good on my promise to try to help others do the same. And so when I was 18 years old, I started a rock band. I met a really cute boy who could play guitar. Yes, I convinced him to sell everything and hit the road, and that's what we did. And even as I was still figuring things out internally, I began putting what I was experiencing into our music. And I was intrigued to find that my seemingly unique struggles, they were actually pretty universal. Like, I was putting what I'd assumed was my exclusive take on pain in our songs, and people were really resonating with that. It was so comforting to say, this is what it's like to be me, and not be met with rejection or blank stares. And that's the first time I really got to experience the rewards of my own mental instabilities. And that's when it began to click that maybe my pain could actually serve me. Like when I was making music, having access to a wide range of emotions, that was a gift, not a curse. But it was the act of letting that out, of sharing. That's what made all the difference. And this is something all of us can benefit from, no matter where we fall on the mental health spectrum or what we do for a living. This idea of sharing the truth of who we are, of getting vulnerable with others. And this doesn't have to look like writing a song about our feelings. It can just mean sidestepping the small talk at a dinner party and valuing connection over impressing people. Or being willing to go deeper with a friend instead of always keeping the conversation light. If we can be brave enough to take part in that act of turning our skin inside out and saying, this is what I look like in here, that creates some of the deepest human connection, the most powerful art, and it's some of the most healing work that we can do. That's why we need to tell our stories. We need to share our traumas. We have to make sure that we're not the only one experiencing this. Because we're not. 73% of Americans experience psychological complications such as depression and anxiety. 73%. You guys, that's the majority. And to think often our suffering is magnified because we feel alone. We feel like we're the crazy one when that's not the case at all. But how could we even know that if none of us are talking about our struggles to begin with? When the majority of us live our lives feeling like we're crazy, maybe that makes crazy the new normal. And maybe that's not terrible news when we remember that it doesn't have to disqualify us from leading a full, wonderful life. And in fact, it can actually contribute to that when we stop hiding and choose to share the truth of who we are. So as I continued to climb out of my depressive hole, I noticed that there were certain ideas, specific practices that accelerated my progress. I wasn't like just this helpless victim of my own sadness. I could do things to influence the way I felt. And I started to pay attention to these things as our band started to grow and we were getting bigger opportunities. So at this point, we were touring the world, we were signed to a record label, all my dreams of being a full-time musician were coming true. And so I was kind of disappointed, actually, to realize that this increase in my quality of life didn't make as big of a difference in my internal well-being as I'd assumed it would. You know, I was getting everything I'd ever wanted, but that didn't magically solve my mental health issues. I had to take it one step deeper, and that meant going deeper inside myself. My tendencies towards self-hatred forced me to study the insides of my own brain, to lovingly hack into it and figure out a way to live here. And what I learned is a skill that all of us can practice: how to listen to the thoughts in our own heads and gently redirect them in a way that serves us. I like to think of this as babysitting my thoughts because that's what it feels like. Instead of just like letting those little punks run wild, I have to keep an eye on them. Yeah. I have to make sure they know I'm in charge around here, not them. So how this works is when a self-defeating thought pops into our heads, we can choose to catch it in the act instead of just blindly believing it. And we're then free to gently guide our thinking to support something that we want to believe, something empowering, instead of something that makes us miserable. We can choose our thoughts on purpose. And what's so cool is when we know how to lovingly hack into our heads, the implications of this are huge. We're free to transform a feeling of anxiety to one of confidence, fear of failure to optimism, self-hatred to self-compassion. And how strange is it to think I never would have learned this life-changing skill if my sadness hadn't led me to it. It was so painful living with a brain like mine that I had to figure out another way, a way that I believe makes my life better than if I had been born with a naturally cheerful disposition, and this blows my mind. So, though I've made a lot of progress, sure, if I'm being honest, you guys, I'm sometimes so discouraged by what a long way I still have to go. Just when I think like, okay, cool, I've got this figured out, life throws a giant curveball, and I start to question everything. But I think it's in those times of struggle where I've actually benefited the most from my sketchy brain chemistry. This idea was really put to the test a few years ago when our relationship with our record label went south, and we had to dissolve our contract by filing bankruptcy. So you're not allowed to take pictures in bankruptcy court, but we managed to get this one, the top of my pink head in the room. Yes. And I'm laughing about it now, but at the time it was really stressful. It was so stressful, in fact, that it led to our guitar player, that cute guy I showed you earlier, who at this point had become my husband, suddenly spiraling into addiction. So he went to rehab, and I felt like my whole world was falling apart. My career, my marriage, my future, that all hung in the balance. It looked like it was just going down the drain. During that time, I needed my own love and support more than ever. And thankfully, I already knew how to care for and comfort myself because I'd been collecting ways to do that for years. See, I'd been practicing something I call joy hunting. And this is as fun as it sounds. This is amazing. So how this works is you're essentially on the lookout for everything that lights you up in life. Okay, so for me, it's like I've discovered it's stuff like creating a beautiful space, lighting candles, listening to jazz music while I'm cooking. It can just be little things like painting your nails your favorite color. Or it can be bigger things like dyeing your hair your favorite color. And what you'll find is after you've been doing this for a while, you've created a beautiful custom list of everything that lights you up in life. And what makes this so powerful is you can refer to this list the next time you find yourself in a dark place. You can use it and instantly have ideas of what will make a real difference for your well-being in that moment. And it all starts with just paying attention. We have to notice where we find joy so then we can track it. And then we can actually learn how to create it. So I never would have guessed this, but another advantage to being born with depressive tendencies is this really bizarre thing where it can lead us to joy. Because those of us who start out at a deficit, we're more likely to dig in and learn what sparks joy for us simply because we have to, in order to feel okay, in order to function. And what takes us from low functioning to normal? Those same skills take us from normal to high functioning. So our proclivity for sadness ends up guiding us to happiness. And oh my gosh, when we know how to create our own happiness on demand like that, we're suddenly eligible for a really high quality of life here, higher than most people get to experience. And the first step is just asking yourself, how can I show up for you right now? I've been doing that a lot lately. I've been practicing talking to myself like I'm still this little 4-year-old girl growing up in Sweden, eating freshly picked parsley from her grandparents' garden, whose biggest concern in life is not getting garden dirt on her pink romper. Like I'm all she has, and my love and validation are all she needs, and why would I withhold that from her? When we stop withholding love and joy from ourselves, the world becomes a much friendlier place to live, and we're able to care for ourselves even in our darkest times. Thankfully for us, one of our darkest times actually has a happy ending. Rehab worked, and my partner is now over 4 years sober. Yes. Like me, he has a brain that could be viewed as broken. His alcoholism means that alcohol affects him differently, just like my depressive tendencies means I process pain differently. So we've both had to learn unique skills to function in this world just to survive our own brain, and we've both really benefited from that. One of the surprising areas that we've actually benefited from that has been in our professional life. See, we were at a really low point in our career after we had just left our record label, filed bankruptcy, battled addiction. But rather than hide these struggles, we chose to share them with our audience. We invited them into our journey. We asked if they'd be willing to partner with us to help us rebuild in this next chapter. And they were here for it. We launched a crowdfunding campaign asking for $2,016. And our fans made it the highest funded music Kickstarter of the year, totaling $127,200. Yes, right? It's amazing. We shared our weaknesses, and this is how people responded, with kindness, with support. And I know, I get it. For those of us who feel broken, it's easy to think, I need to hide this part of myself. I can't possibly share my true self, much less in the workplace. But rather than hurting our reputation, being our true selves in our business, it's been one of our greatest strengths. And so that's where it all begins. And these days, I am so grateful that I was gifted this brain chemistry, but I want to make it clear. The reason it's been a gift for me is because I've had to learn the skills needed to live with it. And that takes work. Having a broken brain, it's not easy, and I'm not here implying that it is. But there are things we can do to make it easier. And there are things we can do to make it work for us. Sharing our vulnerabilities, learning to manage our thinking, identifying where we find joy. These things not only make life easier, they make life better than average. We found that in order to use our pain, we first have to own who we are in the deepest sense. Accept ourselves with all our messed up parts. And that's when our suffering can start being transmuted to something that serves us and allows us to be okay enough to serve the rest of the world. So today, if you find yourself constantly frustrated with the world inside your own head, instead of making that mean that there's something wrong with you, make it work for you. Share the truth of who you are. Learn how to lovingly hack your thoughts. Practice hunting for joy. Let your sadness be the path to a beautiful life. So maybe one day you too can be incredibly grateful for your broken brain. Thank you. Thanks, guys.